We believe we know who we are. In quiet moments, we form a picture of ourselves, a mosaic of memories, beliefs, scars, and longings. But as soon as another person looks at us, this image begins to tremble. Because there, in the eyes of the other, a second version of ourself emerges. Foreign, sometimes flattering, sometimes distorted, often surprising. Self-perception is like an inner monologue, quiet and unceasing. It arises from experiences, from introspection, from what we hope to recognize. It can be clear like a mountain lake or murky like old glass, but it remains subjective and closed in our feelings, filtered through our wishes and fears. We never see ourselves fully, only in fragments, like through a window with half-drawn curtains. Perception by others, on the other hand, is an echo. It does not belong to us. It is conveyed to us through looks, words, gestures, and often also through silence. Others form an image of us based on their experiences, values, and projections. This image is not false, but neither is it true. It is a construction that lives between us like a third presence in the room. The tension between these two perceptions creates friction. We wonder why we are misunderstood, or why praise feels empty. We falter when someone paints a picture of us that we do not recognize. And sometimes we begin to doubt ourselves, not because we have changed, but because the external image has become louder than our own voice. Yet between the I and the you, between self-image and external image, not only friction arises, a space emerges. No possession, no object, but an in-between, fleeting, alive, sometimes painful, often full of possibilities. There is something that is not I and not you. It is neither my judgment of myself nor your judgment of me, and yet it lives between us. It is the space of the third, the invisible that emerges when two consciousnesses meet. Perhaps it begins with a look, a sentence that lingers, a gesture that is misunderstood, and suddenly it exists. This something that is more than projection and yet born of it. It is not neutral. It is charged with expectations, fears, reflections, and with the hope of being recognized. This space of the third is especially palpable in close relationships. In love, for example, it becomes intense and vulnerable, because there we want to be seen completely, and at the same time are most sensitive to what is reflected back at us. Misunderstandings between lovers are often not merely communication problems, but frictions in the invisible in-between. Everyone brings a picture of the other, of themselves, of love, and these pictures collide like flying mirrors. This space is also shaped in childhood. Children perceive themselves through the reactions of adults. A stern look can resonate as a distorted mirror inside for a lifetime. An unreturned smile can seep into self-perception like ink into paper. The third often arises here without words, and yet leaves traces. What we are is also what has been mirrored in the gaze of others before we had language to question it. In the digital world, the third becomes even more abstract. Social media is a stage, a corridor of distorted mirrors. Here, the image that others are supposed to see of us is carefully curated, and at the same time, we are incessantly exposed to the perception of others. Likes, comments, algorithms, all of this shapes a collective external image that often has little to do with inner truth. In this world, self-perception becomes performance, and external perception a metric. And the third, it is algorithmized, commodified, manipulated. Authenticity becomes a longing. And yet in all this lies a possibility for healing. Because when we begin to perceive this space, not only in its pain, but also in its depth, we can consciously shape it. We can learn to distinguish between projection and presence. We can reread relationships, seeing in them not only a stage for ourselves, but a living field where truth slowly unfolds. In families, for example, the third often lives like an old shadow. Unspoken, repeated, inherited, all lies in this space. Whoever enters it can begin to recognize old patterns and perhaps even transform them. In partnerships, the third becomes a touchstone for intimacy. Not proximity alone is the measure, but the willingness to bear each other even in the blur. In digital communication, we must actively protect this space through mindfulness, through truth, through allowing imperfection. And finally, in dealings with power, the third becomes political, because whoever manipulates the perception of others influences not only images, but identities. Power often works not through violence, but through control over what is seen and what is overlooked. Those who create awareness in such spaces heal not only themselves, but also open the way for others to themselves. What we see of ourselves and what others see in us is not only individual, but also culturally shaped. Because the forms of perception surrounding us are not neutral. They grow from language, history, education, media, religion, from unspoken rules about who may show themselves how and who may not. In collectivist cultures, for example, the self is often defined through the community. The image others have of me is not only a mirror, it is part of my essence. Shame plays a greater role there than guilt. Self-perception orients itself to social expectation, belonging, harmony. Whoever falls outside the frame endangers not only themselves, but the whole. In individualistic societies, by contrast, the self is thought of as independent, autonomous, inwardly free. Here, it matters not how much I belong, but how much I am myself. Yet this claim can make one lonely, especially when the external image does not match the self-image. Authenticity is celebrated, but only as long as it fits the picture. Gender, skin color, class, disability, sexual identity, all of these inscribe themselves into the third space between people. There are people who from early on have learned that their self-image is constantly corrected, controlled, or distorted from outside, that their bodies serve as projection surfaces, that their speaking is doubted, their silence interpreted. The third is therefore not a neutral space. It is political. It is permeated by power, by regimes of gaze, by narratives about who may speak and who may not, who is visible and who is overlooked. A person with a migrant background is seen differently. A woman who is angry is reflected differently. A queer body, an old body, a black body, they all carry external perceptions deeply shaped by culture and history. And these perceptions create feedback loops. They seep in, become part of the internal self-talk. Not because they are true, but because they are constantly mirrored. Healing can thus also consist in consciously questioning this space. Which images do you carry about me? Where do they come from? Which images do I carry about you? What may newly emerge here between us? Perhaps the invisible third is the actual place of encounter. No possession, no reflection, but an invitation. An invitation not to fix each other, but to accompany each other. Not to judge, but to witness. And not to force, but to allow, and yet to stay. Perhaps this is our most human ability, to give each other space without losing ourselves. And in this space between your gaze and my breath arises what none of us can see alone, but both can feel.